The Los Angeles County courtroom felt suffocatingly packed. The air was heavy, and the murmuring crowd buzzed like a rising wave of tension on the verge of eruption. The gallery seats were filled, all eyes fixed on the defendant's table, where a young man stood, gaze steady, hands deep in his pockets. No handcuffs, no bowed head, no trace of fear. Daniel James, 19 years old. He was charged with grand theft auto and resisting law enforcement, 2 offenses that could put him behind bars for years, if not for life. Seated above on the bench was Judge Michael, a white man with salt and pepper hair, quietly observing the young man. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingernails against the glossy wooden surface as if this were just another tedious hearing before his afternoon golf tee time. Then he smirked, a half smile, half arrogant, half condescending. "You think you're a lawyer?" he asked, his voice cold. "This isn't your high school debate club, kid." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. It felt as if the entire chamber was bracing for a public shaming. But Daniel didn't laugh, didn't reply, didn't flinch. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering, quiet, yet as sharp as a forensic surgeon's scalpel. And in that moment, brief, fleeting, you could see in Daniel's eyes not the guilt of a thief, but the calm confidence of someone who knew the rules of the game better than anyone else in the room. No one knew they were about to witness a trial where the defendant wouldn't just defend himself. He would flip the entire system upside down. And Judge Michael, who thought he was about to teach the boy a lesson, was about to learn one about justice the hard way. Daniel James wasn't like most other young men who grew up in South Los Angeles. While his peers were obsessed with basketball or video games, Daniel spent his evenings reading case law and listening to his mother, Angela James, a veteran public defender, recount cases she had worked on, edited testimonies, verdicts swayed by bias, and trials where justice was stolen by human subjectivity. Daniel absorbed each story like a child listening to fairy tales. Except here, the villains were often in black robes or tailored suits. He taught himself how to analyze a case in his mind, debate his arguments in front of a mirror, and master the law as if he had lived his entire life inside a courtroom. And then, reality came calling. One ordinary evening, Daniel and some friends stopped by a local convenience store near their neighborhood. Outside, a silver Audi A6 sits idling, and the engine runs. Daniel casually reached for the door handle. The car was unlocked. He opened it, glanced inside, then closed it again. 3 hours later, the car was reported stolen, and Daniel James, the only black teen present in the area at the time, became the perfect candidate for a suspect. No surveillance footage, no eyewitnesses saw him driving the vehicle. Just a single fingerprint on the steering wheel, and a lot of bias. From that moment, Daniel knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't let anyone else tell this story for him. He would defend himself, not because he thought he was better than any lawyer, but because no one understood the truth better than the person falsely accused. And when Judge Michael looked down at him from the bench, eyes full of suspicion, Daniel had already made his decision. He would turn this courtroom into a classroom, and the entire court would have no choice but to listen. The courtroom fell silent as Daniel James gently placed his hand on the shoulder of the public defender and gave a slight nod. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." The words weren't loud, but they were enough to make Judge Michael raise an eyebrow. The entire room froze. Some scoffed, others exchanged astonished glances. Prosecutor Carrington, dressed in a crisp suit with a smug expression, let out a mocking chuckle. Well, this is going to be quite the show. Daniel didn't laugh. He wasn't here to entertain. He was here to be heard. He stood tall, eyes fixed on the prosecutor. "You claim that Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me driving the stolen Audi, correct?" Carrington crossed his arms and nodded. It's clearly stated in the report. Daniel tilted his head slightly. Then I'd like to request the GPS log from Officer Ruiz's patrol unit that night. His voice was steady, unshaken, because I have reason to believe he wasn't even at the scene. A soft gasp rose from the gallery. Carrington hesitated, the smugness fading ever so slightly from his lips. He fumbled through his paperwork as if searching for a lifeline, but found nothing to refute the claim. Judge Michael tapped his gavel lightly, eyes sharp as they turned toward the prosecutor. Does the prosecution object to verifying Officer Ruiz's GPS data? Carrington hesitated. Just a second of doubt, but more than enough for the jury to catch it. No objection, Your Honor. That was the first crack. Daniel pressed his lips together, hiding a faint smile. From that moment on, he knew no one in the room saw him as a defendant anymore. They began to see him as someone who knew something they didn't. He turned his gaze toward the jury. The spark had caught. The atmosphere in the courtroom began to shift. No more scoffing, no more condescending glances. Daniel James stepped forward to face the jury, each step firm, measured, like a seasoned attorney, not a 19-year-old facing prison time. The prosecution says they have my fingerprint on the steering wheel of the stolen Audi. And yes, that's true. Daniel paused, just long enough for his words to sink in. But imagine this. You walk into a clothing store and try on a jacket. You slip your hands into the pockets and zip it up. Then you hang it back and walk out. A few hours later, someone steals that same jacket. Does your fingerprint on that jacket make you a thief? The courtroom fell utterly silent. One juror glanced sideways at the person beside them. A woman in the gallery furrowed her brow and started taking notes. Judge Michael rested his chin on his hand, the casual expression now gone. Daniel stepped forward again. That Audi, before it was stolen, was parked outside the convenience store where my friends and I stopped to grab some snacks. As we passed by, I noticed the car was unlocked. I was curious. I opened the door. I looked inside. I didn't drive it. I didn't take anything. It was a foolish moment, a lapse of judgment, nothing more. His voice dropped, calm but cutting. So, I ask you, does one touch, one fingerprint, make someone a criminal? At the prosecution table, Carrington frowned, flipping through his documents in frustration. But Daniel wasn't finished. He turned toward the judge. Your Honor, has the prosecution called the forensic analyst responsible for examining the fingerprint to testify today? Judge Michael turned his head slightly toward Carrington. The prosecutor swallowed hard, then replied, No, Your Honor. Daniel nodded, not surprised. Your Honor, the single most important piece of evidence in this case is a fingerprint, and yet no expert is present here for me to cross-examine, to verify whether the chain of custody for that evidence was properly maintained. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Daniel turned back to the jury, eyes glowing with clarity and fire. If justice is meant to be a level playing field, then no one, especially a young black man, should be convicted on a fingerprint and a presumption. The courtroom felt like the air had been sucked out of it after Daniel's last line of questioning. Even Judge Michael raised an eyebrow. For the first time looking at Daniel, not as a defendant, but perhaps as a future colleague. But Daniel wasn't finished. He pulled a sheet of paper from his folder, stamped with an official seal, and held it up for the courtroom to see. Your Honor, I respectfully submit into evidence the official statement made by the registered owner of the vehicle. Mr. Raymond Whitaker Carrington jumped to his feet. Objection. This evidence hasn't been... He's the registered owner of the stolen Audi, correct? Daniel cut in, cold and precise. Carrington froze, then gave a reluctant nod. Daniel gave a slight nod in return, eyes locked on the judge. Mr. Whitaker told the police the night the car was taken. I left the engine running while I went into the gas station. When I came back, a kid had taken off with it. But it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw his face. He was white. A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Several members of the jury exchanged hushed words. Daniel continued, slowly, his voice cutting like a scalpel. So why wasn't this statement from the actual victim included in the prosecution's case file? Carrington's face flushed red. He stood frozen, silent. Daniel turned his eyes directly on him. Was it because that statement unraveled the entire narrative? Because it didn't fit the image you wanted to pin on me? The truth was beginning to rise to the surface. Daniel turned back to Judge Michael. The arresting officer, the one who filed the report, ignored this testimony. The prosecution never brought it up. Everyone chose to look the other way. Because I fit the suspect profile. They're used to convicting. Judge Michael lowered his head slightly, the look in his eyes now transformed, serious, contemplative, and perhaps remorseful. Daniel looked around the courtroom once more, then ended with a final clear statement. If justice is about the truth, then we don't get to choose which truths are convenient. The silence in the courtroom stretched on, like a collective breath held tight. Daniel James, the 19-year-old at the center, was no longer just a defendant. He had become the one holding the scales of justice. The entire trial now tilted with the weight of his voice. Judge Michael stroked his chin, his gaze thoughtful, no longer the detached one he wore earlier. He turned to Prosecutor Carrington. Do you have any explanation for why the victim's statement is completely absent from the case file? Carrington opened his mouth, but no words came that could justify it. He stood there, exposed, as if yanked down from a pedestal of authority. Daniel seized the moment. He flipped to another document, a GPS location record from the police department. Your Honor, I also submitted a request to obtain the GPS data of Officer Ruiz, the man the prosecution claims personally saw me driving the stolen vehicle. He turned to the jury. But this data clearly shows that at the exact time the vehicle was taken, Officer Ruiz was nearly 5 miles away, at a coffee stop. A wave of whispers broke out. Daniel continued, his voice firm and unwavering. The evidence doesn't match. The eyewitness account was fabricated. The report was altered, and this entire case is built upon one thing, a prejudice. Judge Michael tapped the desk gently. But this time, not to restore order, to exhale. Daniel stepped forward again. Your Honor, I don't deny that my fingerprints are on the steering wheel, but no one asked. Why only fingerprints? No DNA, no video footage, no eyewitness placing me behind the wheel. He pointed toward Carrington. And when there was no evidence, what did they do? They defaulted. Because I'm a young black man, so I must be guilty. Silence again. But this time, it was the silence of reckoning. The eyes of the jury no longer looked at Daniel with suspicion, but with admiration. Judge Michael adjusted his glasses and exhaled, as if coming down from a personal jolt. We will recess for 15 minutes, he said, his voice deeper and heavier. And I want a full copy of all witness statements submitted immediately. Daniel returned to his seat. He didn't smile. He didn't need to, because he knew every link in the chain used to accuse him was starting to fall apart. When the court reconvened after the break, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. There were no more smug chuckles, no more condescending looks from Prosecutor Carrington, no more detached glances from Judge Michael. Now, every pair of eyes was focused on one person, Daniel James. Carrington stood up, trying to regain control. Your Honor, he began, voice steady but strained. Regardless of any confusion in Officer Ruiz's statement, what cannot be denied is that the defendant was apprehended not far from the scene, just minutes after the Audi A6 was reported stolen. He stepped toward the jury, locking eyes with a woman in the front row. And the most important fact, his fingerprints were on the steering wheel, No matter how eloquent he is, that fact cannot be erased. Carrington paused, believing he had just reclaimed the upper hand. But Daniel remained silent, waiting. Then he slowly stood. No theatrics, no pounding of the table. Just a calm, razor-sharp voice. Your Honor, I respectfully submit into evidence a security video from the 7-Eleven store where the vehicle was allegedly stolen. He turned to Carrington, gaze sharp as a blade. In the 3-minute clip, I and my 3 friends, clearly visible on camera, are seen standing in line, buying drinks and snacks. At the exact time, the vehicle was driven away from the parking lot. A ripple of shock moved through the courtroom. Daniel continued. Not only that, the video clearly shows that a young white male, wearing a brown jacket and a baseball cap, opens the Audi's door, jumps in, and drives off, quickly. No chase, no police presence, and no, me. He looked up at Judge Michael. The police collected this video, but it was never submitted to the case file. Not by accident, by choice. Judge Michael furrowed his brow. Carrington turned pale. Everyone in the courtroom understood. The case was over. Daniel breathed steadily. He said nothing more. He didn't have to. Each piece of evidence had been a pair of shears, cutting through the tangle of bias the system had used to tie him down. And now, no one could deny the truth. The courtroom was silent. Every eye was fixed on the judge's bench, where Judge Michael sat, his hands clasped in front of his mouth, wearing an expression of contemplation not seen at any point in the trial. He no longer leaned back in smug detachment. Gone was the sarcastic tone, the disdainful smirk. In their place, silence, reflection, and perhaps a trace of remorse. Carrington, the once dominant prosecutor who could command the room with a word, now sat quietly, head bowed, with nothing left to cling to. He had placed too much faith in the armor of the system. But today, that system had been stripped bare by a 19-year-old boy. Daniel stood tall, his hand resting lightly on the defense table. No rush, no pleading. He had nothing to beg for. The truth had already spoken for itself. Finally, Judge Michael exhaled, a long breath, not just marking the end of a case, but as if waking from a long dream where prejudice was law and skin color was evidence. He tapped the gavel gently on the bench. This court hereby dismisses all charges against the defendant, Daniel James. You are free to leave this courtroom immediately. A moment of complete stillness. Then, like a dam breaking, the courtroom erupted in murmurs, sighs of relief, and even a few short, discreet rounds of applause from the brave souls seated in the gallery. Daniel remained still, closing his eyes for a brief moment, as if trying to etch this moment into memory. He turned and began walking away, when, Daniel. Judge Michael's voice cut through the air, quiet but unmistakable. Daniel paused. He didn't turn around. A moment passed. Then the judge's gravelly voice echoed behind him. You should seriously consider law school. The room fell still again. Daniel smiled. No response. No promise. He had already made up his mind. The heavy doors of the Los Angeles County Courthouse swung open, and Daniel James stepped out a changed man. No longer a defendant. No longer the black kid suspected of stealing a car. Just a young man who had just silenced an entire justice system. At the foot of the courthouse steps, a swarm of reporters was waiting, microphones pointed like a forest of spears. Daniel, how do you feel after this victory? Did you plan your defense from the beginning? Will you countersue for wrongful arrest? Daniel pulled up the hood of his sweatshirt, his eyes calm and steady. He slipped quietly past the crowd without saying a word, leaving the lenses and flashing cameras in silence. At the bottom of the steps, a woman stood waiting. Denise James, his mother, petite in frame, arms folded, her face caught between anger and profound relief. Daniel approached. They looked at each other for a moment. "You nearly gave me a heart attack in that courtroom," she said, shaking her head, her voice firm, but eyes shimmering. Daniel scratched the back of his head and offered a sheepish grin. "I had to take the risk, Mom." Without another word, Denise pulled her son into a tight embrace, a hug that felt like she was checking to make sure her boy was still there, flesh and bone, not lost in the grinding gears of a broken system. "You're still the most stubborn one in the family," she muttered, her voice trembling. Daniel said nothing. He just held on tighter. Behind them, the cameras kept rolling. But now, the scene wasn't one of spectacle. It was real life, quiet, warm, and deeply meaningful. Across the street, a man leaned against his car, hands in his pockets, eyes distant. Judge Michael. For the first time in years on the bench, he didn't see himself as the one holding the scales of justice. He saw himself as just a man, learning to listen to the truth from those he had once subconsciously underestimated. His gaze met Daniel's for a fleeting moment. And this time, there was no arrogance, only recognition, and perhaps an unspoken apology. After the trial that shook the system, Daniel James's life turned to an entirely new chapter. Gone were the suspicious glances on the street. Gone were the whispers of "that car thief kid" behind his back. In their place came subtle nods, hushed words of respect, and even gratitude. Daniel never sought the spotlight, but now there was no escaping it. At the supermarket, a middle-aged security guard walked up to him. "You're Daniel, right? I saw the trial. You did something nobody else dared to do." At a gas station, a high school girl hesitated before approaching. "I'm trying out for the school debate team. Your speech inspired my entire presentation." Even the local patrol cops, the same ones who once eyed him with suspicion, now gave him nods, hesitant but stripped of prejudice. Daniel didn't need to be celebrated, but he understood one thing clearly. He had done something bigger than just saving himself. A week after the trial, Daniel received an email titled "Pre-Law Scholarship Program at UCLA, Special Nomination." Below it was an offer, a full-ride scholarship granted to young black individuals who had experienced legal injustice but demonstrated academic excellence and unwavering resilience. Daniel froze in place. All his life, his mother used to say, "You don't need to be a hero. Just be someone who stands for what's right. That's enough." And today, that very integrity opened a door he had only dared to dream about. That evening, Daniel sat with his mother on the porch. The house was modest, but the peace was richer than ever before. A gentle breeze carried the scent of jasmine. Denise poured her son a cup of hot tea. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. Daniel stared out at the night, then replied, "I think it's time to stand in the courtroom again, but not at the defendant's table. Next time I'll be at the lawyer's desk." Denise looked at her son, eyes glistening. "Your father would be so proud." Daniel smiled gently. "I won't let anyone else fight alone, like I once had to. Not one more." And that is how a 19-year-old black boy, once falsely accused of grand theft auto, began his journey to becoming a protector of justice for the voiceless. Because justice doesn't come from a title. It starts with one brave enough to stand up when everyone else stays silent. Daniel James thought that after winning in court, his life would ease into a period of peace, whole, hopeful, and calm. But he didn't expect that his victory would make some people feel threatened. Not everyone in the system was ready to accept a young black man who defended himself and exposed the flaws of an entire courtroom, being hailed as a hero. 1 week after the trial, an anonymous email was sent to the UCLA scholarship program that had nominated Daniel. The message was simple, only a few lines. "This applicant has a criminal record. You should review his file thoroughly. Is he really deserving? No signature, no sender. Just the first seed of doubt. At the courthouse, small conversations began to stir. That kid, too arrogant. He humiliated both the prosecutor and the judge right there in court. He's smart, sure. But if everyone starts challenging the system like that, what's left of the law? A senior investigator, someone who'd been close to Prosecutor Carrington, spoke in a private meeting. He dragged our names through the mud. Now the public sees him as some legal genius. If we don't do something, we'll have dozens more like him stepping up soon. At the same time, the media began shifting its tone. A newspaper that once praised Daniel as the 19-year-old legal prodigy suddenly ran a different headline. Behind the spotlight, was the boy truly innocent? The article didn't make direct accusations, but each line sowed suspicion about Daniel's friends, academic background, and even his relationship with Judge Michael. Some questioned, why was such a serious case dismissed so easily? Daniel felt something was off. Interviews were canceled at the last minute. An email from UCLA informed him that the scholarship was now temporarily on hold pending further review. That night, Daniel sat alone in his small room, the glow of his phone casting shadows across his tense face. His mother stepped in. "Something wrong, son?" He set the phone down, his voice low. "They're trying to silence me, not with violence, but with doubt." And Daniel understood. The trial wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The system wouldn't easily forgive the one who embarrassed it. But Daniel wasn't backing down. If they chose to fight with doubt, he would fight back with truth. Crushed by rumors, suspicion, and the cold silence from the places that once praised him, Daniel James could have gone quiet. But he wasn't born to bow his head. Daniel began to fight back, not with fury, but with meticulous preparation, just as he had in the courtroom. He wrote a long blog post, not only recounting the courtroom story, but also listing each instance where information had been distorted, linking articles that used racially biased language, quoting the anonymous email sent to the scholarship committee, analyzing the connection between Carrington and specific internal sources that had spread false narratives. At the end of the post, he wrote, "I'm not the first to be misunderstood, and I won't be the last. But I know how to fight back. How many other black people don't have the tools to do that? I can't stay silent." The post spread like wildfire. On Twitter, the hashtag number #LetDanielSpeak trended at the top. A group of law students launched a Truth Watch campaign, reviewing old cases where questionable evidence was accepted too easily. CBS invited Daniel to join a panel discussion on the justice system. He sat beside a retired judge who said, "If we had 100 more Daniels, I believe justice would finally find balance." And the scholarship? UCLA reinstated it and invited Daniel to be the honored guest speaker at their convocation. A renowned law professor sent him a private message. "If you ever need a thesis advisor, you have my name." And Judge Michael? One late afternoon, as Daniel walked out of a legal reform symposium, the judge stood at the steps outside the university gates. He wasn't wearing his robe, just a man who had once been wrong, learning how to listen. "I used to think you were just a defiant kid," he said, voice raspy. "Now I think you're a beginning." Daniel smiled. "Not a beginning for me. A beginning for everyone who comes after." A year later, Daniel walked into court again, this time with a nameplate in front of him. Daniel James, pro bono attorney for the wrongfully accused. He bowed before his first client, a 17-year-old boy arrested for petty theft with no credible evidence. "You're not alone," Daniel said, his voice steady. "I once sat where you are. Now I stand for you." This wasn't just a cycle repeating. It was the moment a chain of injustice was broken. Daniel James didn't just win a trial. He awakened a generation to the truth that justice is not something to be hoarded. If this story moved you, share it. Because today, it's Daniel. Tomorrow, it could be your friend, your family, or you. And when that day comes, you'll know what to do.